Elijah froze, his hand tightening on the handle of his splitting maul as a branch snapped in the dense Tennessee brush. A second later, the exact same sound echoed from the shadows. Not a natural repetition, but a rhythmic, mocking copy of his own footfall. When he finally gathered the courage to call out into the gloom, the forest didn't offer a bird's cry or the wind's howl. Instead, his own voice crawled back to him from the darkness, carrying his exact weary rasp, whispering his name with a hollow, soulless precision. The air turned stagnant, the birds falling into a sudden, terrified hush as Elijah spotted a track in the red clay that defied every law of nature. It was the size of a man's foot, but ended in needle-sharp talons, leading straight toward his boarded-up cabin where the front door now stood wide open. From the pitch-black cellar, the voice of his mother, dead for over a decade, began to plead for help. But as he reached for the latch, he realized the floorboards weren't just creaking. They were beginning to breathe in time with his own panicked heart. The heavy head of the splitting maul bit deep into the birch round, the vibration traveling up Elijah McCoy's arms and settling into the marrow of his bones. Sweat, thick and stinging, tracked through the red dust on his forehead and pooled in the deep-set wrinkles around his eyes. He didn't wipe it away. He simply reached for another log, his movements rhythmic and mechanical, driven by a need to exhaust the body until the mind had no choice but to follow. Every strike was a strike against the memory of smoke. Every crack of wood was a substitute for the sound of collapsing beams that had haunted his sleep since his last shift at the station. The Tennessee air hung heavy with the scent of sap and damp earth, a sharp contrast to the acrid, clinging stench of char that seemed to rise from his own skin even years later. He worked until his lungs burned, pushing through the fatigue, forcing the ghosts of the fire to retreat into the dark corners of the forest surrounding his isolated farm. He paused, the maul resting against his thigh, and reached for the tin cup of water on the stump. The silence of the mountains was supposed to be a sanctuary, a vast green weight that pressed down on the noise of the past. But as he drank, he felt a familiar twitch in his fingers, a phantom weight where the handle of a fire axe used to be. He looked at his hands, mapped with scars, the skin puckered and silver in places where the heat had been too much. He was 46, but his body moved with the guarded caution of an old man who expected the floor to give way beneath him at any moment. Setting the cup down, Elijah turned toward the narrow trail that wound upward into the thickening timber. He needed to check the perimeter. It was a ritual now, a way to convince himself that the boundaries of his world remained secure. His boots, worn thin at the soles, crunched against a dry branch, the snap sharp as a pistol shot in the humid afternoon. He froze. A heartbeat later, from the dense undergrowth of fern and gray-trunked oak to his right, came an identical crunch. Elijah's breath hitched. He remained perfectly still, his head cocked toward the sound. The woods were usually a cacophony of squirrels and jays, but the air had suddenly turned stagnant, the birds falling into an expectant hush. He waited for the second sound to resolve into the movement of a deer or a stray dog. But there was only a hollow, delayed echo of his own footfall. It hadn't come from the rocks or a nearby cliff face. It had originated from within the trees, moving with a deliberate, mocking mimicry. He turned his head slowly, scanning the shadows. The forest seemed to lean in, the gray trunks of the trees interlacing like the ribs of a great, skeletal beast. He began to walk again, faster this time, and the sound followed. A rhythmic, shuffling ghost of his own pace. Always a second behind, always just out of sight across the ravine. The hair on his arms stood up. He reached for the hunting knife at his belt, the cold steel a small comfort against the growing weight of the silence. He wasn't a man given to flights of fancy, but the rhythm was wrong. It was too precise. He stopped abruptly, and the shadow stepper stopped too. The silence that followed so heavy it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the clearing. "Elijah." The voice didn't come from the wind or the rustle of leaves. It came from the center of a thick stand of hemlocks, perhaps 30 yards away. It was a low, gravelly sound, rough around the edges, carrying the exact, weary cadence of his own speech. It even caught on the slight rasp in his throat, the legacy of too much smoke inhalation. Elijah's jaw tightened so hard he felt the bone ache. His own name, thrown back at him by something that shouldn't have a tongue, felt like a violation. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had closed up, the phantom taste of ash rising again. He scanned the trees, but there was no movement, only the shifting of light as clouds moved across the sun. The voice hadn't sounded human. It sounded like a recording played through a shroud. It was his name, but it was hollow, a shell of a sound with no soul behind it. He backed away, his eyes never leaving the hemlocks. He found himself near the edge of a small stream where the spring rains had turned the bank into a slurry of red clay. He looked down, and his blood ran cold. Near the water's edge, pressed deep into the mud, was a track. It was the size of a man's foot, but lacked the familiar arch. The toes were elongated, ending in sharp, narrow points that had gouged into the earth like talons. The stride was impossible, a leap that would have required a man to be 7 feet tall. Yet the depth of the impression suggested a weight that should have snapped the nearby saplings. The mud hadn't even begun to fill the holes yet. Whatever had made them was still close. He followed the line of tracks with his eyes. They led straight into the lightless heart of the brush, where the canopy was so thick the ground stayed in a permanent, rotting twilight. A scream shattered the stillness. "Help! Someone help me!" It was a woman's voice, shrill and frantic, erupting from a tangle of briars further up the slope. The sound hit Elijah like a physical blow. The old instincts, the ones he tried to bury under piles of split wood and silence, surged to the surface. He didn't stop to think about the tracks or the mimicry. He didn't consider the mechanical, repetitive quality of the cry. He simply ran. Branches clawed at his face, drawing thin lines of blood across his cheeks, but he didn't feel the sting. "I'm coming!" he shouted, his voice cracking. He tore through the underbrush, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was a rescuer again. He was the man who went back into the heat. He ignored the way the woman's voice repeated the same 3 words with the exact same inflection, over and over. Like a scratched record, he reached a small clearing, his boots sliding on the slick leaf litter. He saw a flash of something white in the bushes ahead and lunged toward it, his hand outstretched to help, to save, to finally succeed where he had failed before. A glint of rusted iron caught the corner of his eye. Elijah twisted his body midair, a guttural grunt escaping his chest as he threw himself backward. A massive, ancient bear trap, hidden beneath a thin layer of pine needles, snapped shut with a bone-shredding clang exactly where his foot would have landed. The force of the jaws coming together sent a vibration through the ground that he felt in his teeth. The woman's screaming stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, more terrifying than the noise. Elijah lay on his back, staring up at the canopy, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The trap sat there, its teeth interlocked, a rusted monument to a malice he couldn't name. The woman hadn't been there. There was no one to save. It had been a lure, a calculated attempt to use his own compassion to break his bones. He rolled onto his stomach, his forehead resting against the cool, damp earth. He was being hunted by something that knew him, something that had listened to his grief and learned how to shape it into a hook. He forced himself up, his limbs trembling. He couldn't stay here. He needed to warn the others. The logging camp was less than a mile away, a scar of fresh stumps and diesel fumes where men still gathered around fires. He moved with a frantic energy now, no longer caring about silence, his only goal to find the safety of numbers. When he broke into the logging clearing, the sun was beginning to dip behind the ridges, casting long, bruised shadows across the piles of timber. A group of men sat around a small fire near a rusted skidder, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. Elijah stumbled toward them, his clothes torn, his eyes wide and wild with the adrenaline of the near miss. You need to get out," he wheezed, stopping before the foreman, a thick-necked man named Miller, who was chewing on a piece of dried meat. "There's something in the woods. It's taking voices. It's set a trap. A bear trap." The men went quiet, but it wasn't the silence of concern. Miller looked at Elijah, then at his companions, a slow, mocking grin spreading across his face. He spat a glob of brown juice into the dirt. "Old McCoy's finally seen a ghost, boys," Miller said, his voice dripping with derision. A ripple of laughter went around the circle. One of the younger men, a lanky kid with a grease-stained cap, let out a high-pitched whistle. "Was it a big ghost, Elijah? Or just a little one wearing a dress?" "I'm telling you, it's not a joke," Elijah snapped, his voice rising in a way that made him sound even more unstable. "I saw the tracks. It sounded like me. Then it sounded like a woman. It's dangerous." Miller stood up, his bulk looming over Elijah. He held a heavy iron pry bar in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against his palm. "What's dangerous is a crazy old man running around my camp with a knife and a look in his eye like he's about to bolt. You've been up on that mountain too long, McCoy. Why don't you head back to your shack before you hurt yourself?" The laughter followed him as he backed away, the sound of their mockery stinging worse than the briars. He saw the contempt in their eyes, the way they looked at the city crazy who couldn't handle the quiet. He realized then that he was utterly alone. The mountain had swallowed his reputation along with his peace of mind. He hurried back toward his farm, the twilight deepening into a thick, suffocating purple. As he reached the edge of his property, he stopped dead. The front door of his cabin, the heavy oak door he had locked with 2 turns of the key before leaving, was standing wide open. The darkness inside the house seemed to spill out onto the porch like a physical weight. Elijah approached the steps, his heart a dull thud in his ears. He saw the deep, jagged gouges in the doorframe, marks made by something sharp and powerful. He stepped into the kitchen, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The air inside felt viscous, smelling of old dust and something metallic, like blood on a cold heater. He stood in the center of the room, his hand trembling as he reached for the flashlight on the counter. Before his fingers could close around it, a sound drifted up from the floorboards beneath his feet. "Elijah, son, why is it so dark in here?" It was a soft, quavering voice, flavored with the gentle lilt of a woman who had been dead for a decade. His mother. The flashlight clattered to the floor. Elijah's knees buckled, and he slumped against the wall, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He knew she was in the cemetery in town. He had buried her himself. But the voice coming from behind the heavy, boarded-up cellar door was unmistakable. It carried the exact pitch of her worry, the way she used to call for him when the storms rolled in. "I can't see, Elijah. Come down and help your mother." The rationality in his mind screamed that it was impossible. that it was the thing from the woods. But the grief in his heart was a more powerful force. He took a step toward the cellar door, his hand reaching for the latch. He wanted to believe. He wanted the lie more than he wanted the truth. But as his fingers touched the cold wood, he saw the fresh, clawed furrows in the grain. He saw the way the boards he'd nailed shut months ago were bowing outward, as if something were pushing against them from the dark. He recoiled, a sob catching in his throat. He grabbed a hammer and a handful of long nails from the junk drawer, his movements frantic and clumsy. He began to drive the nails into the door, the rhythmic bang, bang, bang of the hammer drowning out the pleading voice from below. He didn't stop until the entire box of nails was gone, until the door was a patchwork of jagged steel and splintered wood. The voice stopped. Elijah leaned his forehead against the door, his chest heaving. He stayed there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on him, until a different sound broke through. A heavy, authoritative thud on the front door. "McCoy, open up. It's Sheriff Hancock." Elijah peered through a gap in the boarded-up window. Outside, the world was bathed in the harsh, flickering red and blue of a patrol car's light. Thomas Hancock stood on the porch, his jaws set, his hand resting on his holster. Behind him stood two men in white coats, their faces pale and clinical in the strobe light glare. They were carrying a set of heavy-duty gurney straps. "Elijah, we know you're in there," the sheriff shouted, his voice echoing off the trees. "Miller called, said you were threatening his men. We're here to help you, son. Just put down whatever you're holding and come on out." Elijah felt a cold wave of realization. They weren't here to hunt the monster. They were here to hunt him. To the world, he was just a broken man who had finally snapped under the weight of his own trauma. If he went with them, the farm would be empty. The thing in the cellar, the thing in the woods, would have won. "I'm not coming out, Tom," Elijah yelled back, his voice cracking. "There's something here. It's in the house. Look at the ground. Look at the porch." Hancock didn't look down. He stepped closer to the door, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Elijah, I'm not going to tell you again. You're not well. Those tracks are just washouts from the rain. You're seeing things that aren't there because you won't let the past go. Now, open this door before we have to take it down." One of the sanitarians moved toward the side window, a syringe glinting in the crook of his arm. Elijah saw the pity in the man's eyes, the kind of pity you give to a rabid dog before you put it down. "Look at the dirt," Elijah screamed, pointing at the deep gouges near the steps. Hancock glanced down for a fraction of a second, then shook his head. "It's just mud, Elijah. You probably did it yourself with that shovel of yours. Now, enough." The sheriff reached for the handle, but before he could turn it, the air itself seemed to thicken. A sudden, violent pulse of sound, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated the very atoms of the cabin, erupted from the forest. It wasn't a noise so much as a physical blow. The remaining glass in the windows shattered simultaneously, raining shards onto the porch like diamond dust. Hancock dropped his hat, his hands flying to his ears. His face contorted in a silent scream as a thin line of blood began to trickle from his right ear. The sanitarians collapsed to their knees, their eyes rolling back in their heads as the invisible hammer of sound continued to beat against them. Elijah felt his own teeth ache, a sharp, metallic tang filling his mouth. The world became a blur of gray noise, a cacophony that felt like it was trying to pull his brain apart at the seams. He saw his chance. He didn't wait for them to recover. He turned and bolted through the back door, disappearing into the dark maw of the forest before the sheriff could even look up. He ran until his heart felt like it would burst, the branches tearing at his clothes, the ground a treacherous maze of roots and shadows. He had to get away from the help. He had to find a place where the sound couldn't reach him. But as he deeper into the timber, the woods began to talk back. "Fifth Squad, move in. McCoy, where are you?" The voice of his old captain boomed through the mist, so loud it seemed to come from the trees themselves. The forest was suddenly alive, with the sounds of a fire that didn't exist. The hiss of high-pressure hoses, the crackle of burning pine, the frantic chatter of radios. Elijah saw shadows moving between the trunks, figures in heavy turnout gear that beckoned to him with charred hands. "Elijah, over here, help me." It was his partner, Miller, not the foreman, but the man he'd lost 5 years ago. The voice was coming from a thicket of ferns to his left. Elijah veered toward it, his heart overriding his fear. "I'm coming. Hang on." He lunged through the ferns, his hand reaching out for a phantom shoulder. His boots skidded on a patch of wet moss, and he felt the sickening lurch of gravity as the ground vanished. He slammed his heels into the dirt, his body jerking to a halt as he peered over the edge of a sheer, scalisty cliff. The voice was coming from the bottom of the black, wet abyss, 100 feet below. There was no fire. There were no firefighters. He scrambled back, his breath coming in jagged sobs. The thing was using his life as a script. Every failure, every death he'd witnessed, was being replayed to lure him to his own. He stumbled into a small grove, where a gnarled elm tree stood, its bark covered in strange, pale gray growths that looked like human ears. As he brushed against the trunk, the tree began to vibrate against his palm, a rhythmic thumping that perfectly matched the frantic pace of his own heart. The fungal plates shivered, releasing a cloud of glowing phosphorescent spores that hung in the air like a sickly veil. He realized then that the forest wasn't just a setting. It was a sensory organ. The trees, the fungi, the very soil was part of a single, massive organism that drank in his terror and broadcast it back to him. Behind him, he heard the shouts of the sheriff and the loggers. They had regrouped, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom like searchlights. But to Elijah's ears, their voices were no longer human. The mountain was taking their words, shredding them into aggressive, metallic barks that sounded like the grinding of gears. The men were lost too, circling in the dark, chasing their own echoes. Elijah retreated toward the farm, but the house he had built was no longer a home. The log walls were pulsing, expanding and contracting like a giant lung. A high-pitched, wailing cry, his mother's voice, now distorted into a terrifying shriek, was erupting from the foundation with such force that the roof tiles were rattling like teeth. He couldn't go back. He couldn't stay. The townspeople were blocking the road with their trucks, their faces grim and hateful in the glare of the headlights. They saw the crazy man and the devilry on the mountain, and they wanted it ended. Elijah backed away into the deepest part of the woods, his boots finding the edge of a massive, lightless overhang. A bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating a ring of men with axes and chains, their eyes reflecting the violet glare. They were closing in, their movements jerky and strange, as if they were being moved by invisible wires. The thunder that followed wasn't thunder. It was the roar of a firestorm, a sound so loud it felt as though his eardrums were being pierced by needles. Elijah fell to his knees, blood beginning to seep from his nose and ears. The world was dissolving into a physical wall of vibration. He saw the loggers tossed aside by an invisible force, their bodies flying like rag dolls into the brush. He saw the trees themselves begin to shed their bark, revealing white, pulsating flesh beneath. The fire was everywhere now. Not heat, but the sound of heat. a roar that consumed all other thought. He saw the ghosts of his family in the center of a swirling vortex of sound, their mouths open in a never-ending scream. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and burning copper. The vibrations were so intense that the very stones at his feet began to hover, suspended by the pressure of the air. Elijah looked up at the twisting gray sky and opened his mouth to scream his own agony into the void. But then he saw it. He saw the way the sound ripples reacted to his breath. He saw the way the monstrous shapes grew more defined, more powerful, with every sob he let out. The thing wasn't just hunting him. It was eating his reaction. It was a parasite of sound, and he was the host. He didn't scream. He clamped his hands over his mouth, biting down on his own skin until he tasted blood. He forced himself to go limp, to let the air leave his lungs in a slow, silent stream. He closed his eyes and focused on the silence between his heartbeats. The roar of the firestorm faltered. The screaming of his mother's voice dropped in pitch, becoming a confused, static-filled mumble. Elijah didn't move. He became a stone. He became a root. He stripped away the fear, the guilt, the memory of the smoke, until there was nothing left but the cold, empty present. The vibrations began to fade. The hovering stones fell back into the mud with a dull, natural thud. The phosphorescent spores dimmed and vanished. The fire retreated into the shadows, leaving behind only the damp, quiet smell of a rainy Tennessee night. The creature above the ravine let out one last, frustrated howl, a sound that was a patchwork of every voice it had ever stolen. And then it was gone. The forest was just a forest again. Elijah waited until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the canopy. He climbed out of the ravine, his movements fluid and silent. He walked past the abandoned trucks on the road, past the men who lay shivering and broken in the dirt, their minds unable to process the silence. He walked into the village, his face a mask of iron. When Sheriff Hancock tried to stop him, tried to demand answers, Elijah didn't speak. He simply looked at the man with eyes that had seen the end of sound. He returned to his farm and began to pull the boards off the windows. He did it slowly, without a word. He didn't need the boards anymore. He didn't need the noise. He sat on his porch as the sun rose, watching the woods. He knew they were still there. He knew the mountain was still listening. But as long as he held the silence within him, as long as he refused to give his pain a voice, he was the master of the mountain. He was the man who had defeated the fire by becoming the ash. And in the perfect, heavy silence of the morning, Elijah McCoy finally found his peace.